This session is entitled In the Wake of 1881, and it focuses on two figures, in particular Moshe Leib Lilienblum and Leon Pinsker, more broadly on two organizations, what was called in Hebrew Bilu and Chibat Zion, and above all, it focuses on what we call in Hebrew the Aliyah Rishonah, the first Aliyah, which began in 1882-1883 and it concluded in 1903, sending anywhere from 25 to 35,000 Jews, mostly from Eastern Europe, to the land of Israel. Of course, I call it In the Wake of 1881 because, as you can see from the picture, the shocking event of 1881 were the pogroms that took place in Russia in the wake of the assassination of Alexander II, the Tsar. Historians have asked the question, why were the pogroms such a surprise? In other words, why did they elicit such a reaction from Jewish intellectuals, and in particular the Maskilim, the Jewish enlighteners? There were waves of pogroms, but it's also interesting to speculate to what extent the awareness of pogroms affected people on a day-to-day level in terms of their general orientation, both towards their non-Jewish neighbors, but also towards what it meant to be living in a society like Russia. The pogroms, our best knowledge of to date, is that they were spontaneous, mainly started off as workers' riots. The government didn't plan them, nor did they support them. The new Tsar, who was much more autocratic than his father, Alexander III, was in fact instinctively afraid of revolution and instability, and the pogroms suggested those forces to him. But the fact that they weren't common, that is to say, the fact that these pogroms were unusual, probably helps explain the degree to which the Maskilim were shocked, especially those who were living in a secularized, Russified urban area such as Odessa. But the key element, obviously, for our story is that the Maskilim felt the need to respond to these pogroms, and that, I think, is the first thing that is worth noting about this phase in the history of Zionism, which is that these post-1881 thinkers are more practical than earlier precursors. That is to say, they're actually responding to something discrete that has happened in history, and they are trying to make certain kinds of practical moves that earlier precursors had not been doing. In the case of Lilienblum, he was someone who had grown up in a traditional Jewish environment. He had broken from that environment, and the pogroms suggest a couple of things to him. One of which is a need for normalization, one of which is a need for pluralism, Jewish pluralism, and one is a kind of a weakness of his, which is that he lacked a concrete plan for a response to the current events. So let me write these things down here. First was normalization. Second was pluralism. And the third is he lacked a concrete plan. Lilienblum was writing against the figure of Yehuda Leib Gordon, who was a bit older than he was. Gordon had also been a major Jewish enlightener, but his goal had been to modernize Judaism, which really reflected his opposition to orthodoxy. For Lilienblum, orthodoxy is not the issue. The issue is national self-consciousness. And this is a matter of survival. And this is more important than sectarianism. And he assumed that the content of such a nationalism would inevitably be pluralistic. So let's add here that even though he did lack a concrete plan, that he was focused mainly on raising national self-consciousness, which was more important than sectarianism. Now I want to turn to these groups, the lovers of Zion, Chovei Tzion, and Bilu, and say a bit about them. See a romantic image here of these men and women working in the fields. They look quite young, although I realize the picture is somewhat blurry. This was a loose group, more Russians than others. Their main commitment was settlement in the land of Israel. They were also a philanthropic organization. They spread the knowledge of the land of Israel, wanted to support collectives, which of course would later on become the kibbutzim. They wanted to support farmers, not merchants or traders. And they didn't talk of sending people themselves. The Bilu, which stands for Beit Yisrael, it's an acronym from the Hebrew verse from the book of Isaiah. Beit Yisrael lechu b'neilcha, house of Jacob, let us go up, were extremely idealistic. They wanted to settle the land of Israel, but they were hamstrung by their lack of knowledge of agriculture. They had certain rules that, for example, everyone who immigrated to Israel had to be under the age of 25. Many of them were Jewish students at the university in Kharkov. They were observant. They followed the laws of the Torah, and that was a unifying force for them. But they did so more for national than religious reasons. They wanted to set up agricultural settlements, but they knew nothing about agriculture. All they had was an ideology that, of course, that they had really learned in Russia. If you think here about figures like Tolstoy, all they had was an ideology of becoming productive, of productivization. And their vision of agriculture was collective and not private property. So let's keep track of what they were doing. So first of all, they were students. They were observant. They believed in agriculture, in an ideology of productivization. And they were into collective rather than private property. And their definition of what the roles of Jews should be was as laborers. Laborers could include landowners, factories, schools. They're strongly nationalistic. They worked hard to learn Hebrew because it was the national language. But what needs to be said about both Chovei Tzion and Bilu is that none of the above had practical enough ideas. That is, they didn't create a state. The question is, why not? And here I think it's worth looking at Leon Pinsker, who wrote probably the most famous response, his pamphlet Auto-Emancipation, but he also had no plan. He was appealing to powerless Eastern Europeans and not the politically enfranchised Western Europeans, who might have been more likely to think in pragmatic ways about actually planning not just a settlement, but a kind of a settlement with a political strategy with a discrete political goal, like autonomy in some legal sense that would be recognized by, in this case, forces like Western powers, and of course, most specifically, the Ottoman Empire, in which Palestine existed at that time. Bilu was idealistic without the practical necessities. It was focused mainly on garnering philanthropic support. So let me say something about Pinsker. Pinsker was a second-generation Jewish enlightener. His father was a scholar of Judaism and the Karaites. Of course, the Enlightenment, just to go back for 1 second, the Enlightenment believed that a common culture could exist that would be much more universalistic in its focus, and it also believed, therefore, that Jewish integration in Western society, in your modern European society, was possible. The French Revolution stood for universal progress, reason and rationality. These watchwords suggested that the world progresses as rationality gains. In spite of reactionary setbacks, the march of history seems clear. Pre-modern culture looked backwards always in search of recapturing past glory. The Enlightenment taught that glory was in the future, that science would take us into a better, happier, civilized world. And Russian Jewish Muskilim, these enlighteners, under the within the reign of Alexander II, who reigned from 1855 to 1881, he did free the serfs, he set up more courts, Russia became more of a legally oriented society and state, which in its time was called glasnost. You may recall that term from Mikhail Gorbachev's time in the late days of the Soviet Union in the 1980s. Pinsker is in the vanguard of this era. He believes that progress will change Russia and the Jews. He wants the Jews to study Russian culture and language. He really believes that they ought to be Russians of the Mosaic persuasion. And even though religion, in any traditionalist sense, is largely irrelevant as an Enlightenment idea. He writes this pamphlet, Auto-Emancipation, in the wake of the pogroms of 1881, trying to make the case that there is a scientific proof, trying to lay out scientific proof for the impossibility of Jewish integration. So in other words, he's totally changed his mind about what the trajectory of Russian Jewish life should be, away from integration and towards a homeland of their own. Only with a state will the Jews gain respect. Auto-Emancipation appears anonymously in German. He's writing for Germans, that is to say Middle Europeans, who had been recently emancipated. He utilizes social science and its metaphors, biology, psychic aberrations, heredity, pathology. These terms come up in this essay. The nation is a natural entity. It is an organic entity. And he's writing a polemical plea with pseudoscientific methodology. The Jew as a parasite. This is at the same time as the rise of racial anti-Semitism. The Jew as a race, which becomes a new form of anti-Jewish polemic. So let's write some of this just to recap this. Right, instead of integration, he now advocates homeland for the sake of self-respect.